Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 154 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Ashlee Vance, author of the new book Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. It's a biography of South African-born entrepreneur Elon Musk, who made over $100 million as one of the founders of PayPal, then used that money to help launch leading companies in the fields of solar energy, electric cars, and private spaceflight. Musk is also a big fan of science fiction and comic books, and credits them with inspiring his mission to help save the world through new technology. And now, here's our interview with Ashlee Vance. All right, so we're here with Ashlee Vance. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so you say in your book that you were initially a bit skeptical about Elon Musk. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I guess I've covered Silicon Valley for about 15 years for a few different places. I worked at the New York Times and at Business Week, and I don't know, Elon always struck me as kind of the guy who talked the biggest but didn't always deliver on what he was talking about. I felt like I'd heard about the Tesla Roadster for so many years before it appeared, and then there's kind of a big gap between that and the next car. And then I think I probably just hadn't paid as much attention to SpaceX as I should have, and sort of chalked it up to being a space tourism company, and I guess ignored it a little bit because of that. And then in 2012, I realized that SpaceX had got to the International Space Station, and then the Model S came out from Tesla in pretty quick succession. And then I was like, wow, I mean, this guy who's been out there harping on these things for a long time. It took him a little bit longer, but he seems to be delivering on what he was talking about.
Well, right, and I'm curious about this whole thing because you say that you thought of him as a card-carrying member of Silicon Valley's techno-utopian club. Could you say a bit more about that whole group?
That's the other thing, I guess. Yeah, it gets a little much sometimes in Silicon Valley with people. It's like I cover technology, so I like it and I'm interested in it. But just, there's so much about it's just sort of perfect and the answer for everything, and technology is never wrong. And a lot of it, I guess, comes from more the kind of consumer web services and apps and things like that. And then some of the people who are chasing life extension and some of these topics that, I'm interested in as well, but are a little more out there. And I guess I just sort of put Elon in that category more. I mean, probably a fair bit from my ignorance. And then also, some of the things he says certainly fit into that. But so basically in 2012, when SpaceX and Tesla kind of hit their milestones, I pitched a cover story on him for Business Week and got to go report on them. And when I saw the factories, that blew me away. But then when I interviewed Elon, he was so much more interesting than I think I'd given him credit for. He answered questions really authentically, I thought, and actually thought about them, and was way more layered as a person than I'd been expecting.
Right. I mean, from the way that you talk about him in the book, he kind of seems like a real geek. You say he's a little bit socially awkward, in kind of a charming way.
Yeah, I think you can see some of that in his presentations. I think he's gotten a lot better at giving these product launches and announcing products, but certainly he doesn't come off to me, at least, as kind of Steve Jobs polished or anything like that. He can be a little jittery and stop and start when he's talking, and just sort of more of like an engineer that you might think of in your head. And there's definitely some of that when you first start talking to him. He's not really kind of the chummy guy that you would have a beer with and sit down with at a baseball game and just kind of have small talk or anything like that. It's a little more intense. But I think for his friends and his family, I know they see a different side of Elon that's a little more relaxed and funny. And I got to see some of that too. It just takes a while.
Right. I assume you saw the recent Simpsons episode, The Musk Who Fell to Earth. Is that basically what he's like in real life?
Right. I thought he was a pretty good sport in that one. I think they took it probably, it being The Simpsons, I thought they took it, to its logical end, and that he's not quite like that with the, I'm looking for something to represent my emotions and everything. But obviously they had sort of tuned in to at least what I saw and what I think other people see. But just Elon read the script for that, right? So it points that he's not completely like that he'd be willing to poke fun at himself like that, I think.
Right. And so you met him and you wrote this article, and then at what point did you decide that you wanted to write a whole book about him?
Pretty quickly after I'd seen the Tesla factory, and I thought this is cool. And then when I went to visit the SpaceX factory, I was just blown away. I mean, it's literally kind of in the middle of Los Angeles, and I think I had expected to see one rocket being worked on by a few dozen people, but it's not quite mass assembly, because there's not that many rockets that go off. But I mean, they're producing a dozen, if not dozens, at a time, and it was thousands of people in this constant hive of activity. And I just had no idea something quite like that existed right in the middle of Los Angeles in California in the United States, and was blown away. And then when Elon was such a good interview, I saw it pretty quickly. I'd been looking for a book to do. I've always gravitated towards companies that manufacture stuff as opposed to kind of web things. And so I just thought, yeah, this is the book for me. And I went and told Elon that, and he told me that he didn't care, and he wasn't going to help me. And that's sort of how it started.
Well, and then what was the whole I mean, how many people did you interview, and how long did it take, that sort of thing?
It took a while. I told him I wanted to do the book, and he said, no, other people have asked me before. And he said he wanted to write his own book. I told him he probably didn't have time to do that, but he said he did. And then you sort of do this process where you write a book proposal, and I actually kind of like sold that in New York to the publishing companies. And then I went back to Elon on a Saturday. I'll never forget it. I went to Tesla and told him, look, I've sold the book. Here's all the reasons you should participate now. And he still said no. He was very nice about it. And then he wasn't a jerk or anything like that at all. If people would call him and ask if they should talk to me, and he would almost always tell them yes. And that included some of his really good friends and some of his family. And so I went through about 200 people, and it took about 18 months of that. And then I got this call at my house one evening. I'll never forget that either. It was like Elon Musk pops up on the caller ID. And he was kind of like my white whale at that point. It was weird because we'd email, but he would never budge at all. So then when I saw this phone call, I knew kind of something must be coming. And then he popped on the line. He said, look, he seemed to always think he could like still shut the book down. And so he said, I can make life really difficult on you, or I can cooperate. And I sort of just ignored the first part and tried to convince him on the second part.
Well, and he did end up cooperating, right? I mean, didn't you do something like 30 hours of interviews with him or something in the end?
He did. So we had that conversation on the phone, and then we set up a dinner, and he said, look, if I'm going to do this, I want to be able to read the book first, and I want to put in footnotes. And I had this big kind of speech about why I thought that was a bad idea and how I couldn't let him do that as a journalist. And to his credit, I only got about 5 minutes into my 45-minute speech, and he said, okay, fine, just do it. And so I think he was a good sport about that. I mean, it's got to be sort of a horrible process to have somebody dig into your life for that long and talk to all these people, and for you to have no idea what's coming. And so then we agreed to have sort of like dinner once a month, and we'd have these pretty long dinners. He tends to eat pretty late, like around 8 or 8:30, and we'd meet at the restaurant, and then a lot of times we shut it down. And then the other huge difference was that I got access to the executives at the companies, because at both SpaceX and Tesla, there's 4 or 5 people at the top level who've been there basically for the entire history of the companies, and a lot of them built sort of the key technologies and knew all the good stories. And since Elon does almost all the press, they don't get any ink, and nobody really knows who they are. And I wanted to be sure to get them in the book.
Yeah, and so and you talked to Elon a lot about his childhood and teenage years and stuff, which was really interesting. And he's so compelling to me because he seems just like my friends and I, that he's into science fiction and comic books and video games and Dungeons and Dragons and all these things. but sort of crucially, unlike my friends and I, he like made hundreds of millions of dollars and can actually try to do all this stuff in real life. But could you just talk about that aspect of like how science fiction and comic books influenced him?
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, but there is this definite down-to-earth quality about him even today. I mean, I think he'll go work 20 hours and blast off a rocket, and then I know this for a fact, he'll come back and crash on a friend of his couch and fall asleep playing BioShock, which is kind of like a funny thing to picture. But when he was a kid, I think he seemed to consume science fiction at this like amazing rate. I mean, he read through just about like every library and bookstore that was in his neighborhood, and the science fiction stuff was what really grabbed him. And he won Dungeons and Dragons tournaments, and all this stuff seems to have been it was definitely fun for him and entertaining, but it seems to have been a calling as well. I think from a really early age he was locked into space as this thing he had to do.
Right. Yeah, so in the book, you mentioned some of his favorite fantasy and science fiction books were Lord of the Rings, Asimov's Foundation, Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Since this is Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, obviously that's a favorite of ours.
And he talks about those all the time, right? I mean, he'll rattle that off, with ease.
I mean, is there anything that he said about those books that didn't make it into the book? Into your book?
Not really. I mean, he always points to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as just kind of his guiding principle for sort of deciding that you should find out what the big questions are, and then once you do, that's what you go tackle. And I mean, he talks in the book about, I think he was like 14 or 15, and he has, I think like maybe a lot of teenagers do, he's like questioning God, and he's like reading all these religious texts and philosophical texts, and that's kind of what really grabbed him at that moment in time, was that you should settle on kind of a handful of big questions and the stuff that you think is important and go after it full bore. And so that's what every time I sort of started fishing around in that area, that's what he would point back to.
Yeah, I can totally see. I mean, Hitchhiker's Guide is one of my favorite books, obviously, and it's a funny science fiction novel, but it really grapples with profound questions. And I think that's, I could totally see that, becoming
That's how he operates, right? Everyone, when I talk to people and they say, why does he want to go to Mars? I mean, it just seems so silly to some people, but I think to him that is the important. It's like making man a multiplanetary species is fundamentally huge, important thing, and he's identified it, and nobody else was doing anything about it, so he decided to.
Right. It's funny because you talk in the book a lot about how people think he's crazy, but from my point of view, I mean, everything about him makes total sense because I'm so similar. But to me, everyone else seems crazy, that people act as if 100 years from now is like Narnia. It's like some crazy thing that could never possibly happen, when in fact 100 years from now is an inevitability, and everyone should be thinking about it because it's really important.
Yeah, he seems a hard figure for other people to wrap their head around. When I was first pitching the book in New York, he definitely did not have the same cachet as he had in Silicon Valley, and this whole Mars thing totally baffled people. And then they would say, this was even in 2012 when SpaceX had already docked with the space station, and then they would all say, but what's he done? When's he gonna come through, and what have you done? Getting something to the space station, this is a huge accomplishment. I mean, this is something only kind of nations do, and so I think when a lot of other people hear, I think it just depends who you are. When some people hear the Mars thing, it just doesn't resonate with them. I am not I was like neither a car person nor an aerospace sort of space person coming into this, but I mean, I try to look through everything of sort of the lens of his brain, and it makes total sense to me from that perspective.
Right. Well, on the subject of Mars, I mean, maybe for listeners who don't know, talk a little bit about his aspirations for Mars, and talk about the posters that they have in the lobby of SpaceX.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. I mean, you first walk up So you walk in the SpaceX doors and you kind of turn right, and Elon's cubicle is pretty close to where the front door is. And right before you get to it, there's these two posters of Mars, and one is kind of Mars as it is today, and then one is where it's been totally transformed into a habitable planet, and it's green and blue and and looks wonderful. And so that's right by Elon's office. It's pretty funny. It took him a while he talks about this stuff readily, that he wants to set up a colony on Mars and that he thinks we might be able to start doing launches by 2026. And then kind of funny because you push a little deeper on the plans, and I could never tell how concrete they were. I know for a fact now SpaceX has the Falcon Heavy, which is kind of their next giant rocket, and then there's one after that that's even bigger. And they've already got the engines for that design. They haven't built them, but they have them in CAD, and they have the structure for the craft. And knowing sort of the quality of the engineers there, I think it would work. And then Elon in the book, he talks a lot about, he knows what fuel he would want to use for it, and he's got it down to that level. And then one of my favorite parts is he starts talking about when the Earth and Mars are close. I think it's sort of kind of like a 1 month window where you'd want to do as many launches as possible. And he starts talking about, he wants to have these automated launches and set up hundreds, if not thousands, of rockets per day, and just this huge tonnage of cargo. And he thinks that you have to get sort of each flight down to about, I think, $200,000 to $500,000 per flight to make it kind of a thing where entrepreneurs and sort of early colonists would give up their life on Earth to go chase after that.
Right, and in the book you quote him as talking about having millions of people from Earth going to Mars. That's pretty ambitious.
Right. I apologize. I don't have my book right in front of me. I should, but he goes into he's totally run the math on all this stuff, right? Sort of how many people he needs, how much tonnage of cargo, how many flights it would take. He's dead serious about it all. It's kind of funny because then sometimes if I'd push on the terraforming kind of stuff, or what would the habitat be like, and he's like, oh, that's the easy part, and I could never tell if that was just I don't have that figured out, or I really do already have that figured out. But I don't know, because when you talk to some other guys, they sort of feel like he's shortchanging the difficulties of the plan.
Yeah. Well, talk about what other things he's involved. He's also involved with the electric cars and solar energy and stuff. Talk about sort of from a science fiction perspective, if Elon Musk, if everything goes according to plan, kind of how will he transform the world in the next decade or so?
The last chapter of the book is kind of this unified field theory of Elon Musk. And you can definitely see overlap between the companies today. SpaceX they've done all kinds of interesting sort of work with material science and things to get geeky, I guess, friction stir welding, which is this really interesting welding technique for creating stronger welds between large sheets of metal. And Tesla's going to start using that now. And then with Solar City, we're already seeing that they're taking their solar panels and putting that energy into these Tesla storage packs that are going on houses and buildings now. And then some of the Solar City panels go onto the Tesla recharging stations for the cars. And so all this stuff gets threaded together. I think from a science fiction perspective, it's pretty incredible that he would have, so, he's not only building the electric cars, but he's building this recharging network. So in my head, I always picture the U.S., and this is not coming from an Elon fanboy part. I totally am into what he's doing, but this is just kind of if I play out the fantasy in my head, is that you've got the U.S. with this totally decaying infrastructure and crappy highways, and then I feel like it's a cool sort of thought that maybe we wake up in 5 or 10 years and we have not just Teslas, but lots of electric cars, and there's a electric charging network that's been built, and that it's not just Elon's companies, but that this one guy sort of like pushed all this stuff along is pretty incredible to me. And I don't know. I mean, the possibility that you could wake up in 5 or 10 years and have that be a reality is, I think, like amazing and sort of inspiring. And then, I mean, I don't know how much you want to get into it, but obviously he talks about things like the Hyperloop, and then the other thing he really wants to get to is this electric sort of vertical liftoff plane. Have you heard him talk about that?
I just what I read in your book.
The book, yeah, because so he's got this idea that instead of where we have airports today on the edges of cities because they're loud and they need the big runway, it'd be so much cooler if you wanted to go to New York just to fly right into Manhattan for your meetings and zip out. And so he wants to make kind of a quiet, all-electric jet that can do vertical liftoff and landing. And it sounds like Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Google kind of want to help him out on that project.
Right, and you talk about how those guys will all hang out in an apartment in Palo Alto and talk about like a commuter plane that never lands, it just flies around the world and you kind of hop up to it and hop down.
I was trying to understand exactly how that would work because it was like a guy who had been in on one of these dinners, but if I could sit in on anything, it would be one of these dinners. Apparently, the Google guys do. They have a secret apartment in Palo Alto that's been described to me as kind of one of the taller buildings in Palo Alto, and there's not that many tall buildings. And this is where they go to do their brainstorming. And this guy I interviewed, George Zachary, he's a venture capitalist. He got to sit in on this dinner between Elon and Larry and Sergey. And because I interviewed Larry for the book too, the way they explain it to me is that they just come up with thousands of ideas during these dinners and then pick like one or two to actually go build. But yeah, it seems like there's like a refueling station that's constantly orbiting the Earth, and you like zip up to it and grab some fuel and then zip down to wherever you need to go. I think I explained it better in the book, but I have to confess I never fully got it.
Well, and then another one of these like pie in the sky kind of things is the space internet. Could you talk about that?
That's probably closer to reality. I've covered that in sort of a bunch of different ways. There's this guy, Greg Weiler, who has been after this for a while. Today there's a company called O3B, which has, I think, 12 satellites up, and it's basically delivering the internet for what they call like the other 3 billion. That's why it stands for O3B. And it's for places where you can't get fiber. And so they've managed to put the satellites in a bit of a lower orbit, and so you get decent latency, and so you can still do all the kind of stuff that we would like to do, like cloud services and video games and everything in remote islands like in the Pacific and whatnot. But I guess the plan now that Elon has and shared with Google, and then this guy Greg Weiler has got his own competing startup called Worldview, I think, or OneWeb, is to, instead of putting up 12 satellites, is to put up thousands of satellites in a much lower orbit, and then basically blanket the world with this low latency internet delivered from space. And I guess in Elon's vision of this, I mean, it would again serve this other 3 billion that can't get fast internet, but then he also sees it as like a high-speed backhaul for everybody's internet traffic. And I love the way he describes it, which is that the speed of light goes faster in space, in the vacuum. And so it makes sense to do sort of the large-scale backhaul shifting of internet traffic in space and then dump it back down to the Earth.
Right, and it's even bigger than that, right? Because he just sees this as a test run for doing the same thing on Mars and giving Mars internet, right? Right, yeah.
Only Elon could describe it this way, right? So when he first announced sort of the plans to make it's basically kind of like a backup internet in space, and that would seem to be sort of big enough for most people. But, well, he sees it in two ways. One is, so he wants to eventually charge money for this. I mean, SpaceX makes a ton of money sending up commercial satellites and everything, but to get to Mars, I mean, he needs to raise a lot of money. And so he's seeing this as like a giant ISP for the world that he could charge for. then raise money for SpaceX, and then being the first leg of a space internet. And yeah, I think in my story that I wrote, he said, well, we're going to need the internet on Mars, right? So might as well get started now.
Right. And then also speaking of Mars, one of the other really cool things in the book was you talk about maybe Craig Venter is going to be working with Elon to do some sort of 3D printer that could print out biological stuff for Mars colonists.
They've definitely talked about this already. I sat in Craig's office, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about this with Elon too, but when I talked to Craig, he said, yeah, Elon and I have talked about this. They want to make sort of like your synthetic biology 3D printer and put one of those on Mars, and then you'd be able to send it instructions to print out whatever you want and sort of make organisms there. Even if you didn't have that many people, you could have these printers there doing work for you. And before you got there, and then I mean, any of this terraforming kind of stuff seems like that would be the way you might do it, is to send up tons of organisms to try and work on heating Mars up for you.
Yeah, and so like I should be clear, like Elon, he has all these really ambitious ideas, but he's actually come through on a surprising number of them so far, as you said. And there was a line in the book that really struck me. You said, surely Musk did not have the gall to try to revamp the very idea of the automobile and build an energy network at the same time, with a budget equivalent to what Ford and Exxon spend on their annual holiday parties.
It is true, though. He does, I think, I don't know how many people that listen to the show, how closely they follow Tesla, but when it's sort of like he came out with the Model S, and then he said, oh, we're going to build this network of charging stations, and then they announced like 6 in California and Arizona and Nevada, and then I sort of figured it would go really slowly from there as far as building out that network goes, especially given that Tesla, like they make a lot of revenue on their cars, but they're not sort of printing money like a software company or anything like that. And so the thought that today, I mean, there's hundreds of these charging stations, and they're on at least 3 continents that I can think of, is nuts. And you go to the Tesla headquarters, and they have all these charts on like how much we've saved on gasoline from the network, and it's some pretty lofty figures now. But SpaceX is probably even more impressive. I mean, I think the first Dragon capsule would have cost on the order of $1 billion all told, and in space money, that's insane. I think, like at best, you could be thinking that somebody else would build that for $10 billion. So at least a tenth. And then some of my favorite stories in the book are these contractors that SpaceX goes to, and it's like they want like a turbo pump for the engine, and if Boeing was asking for that, it would be like $100 million on a 5-year project, and SpaceX would give them like $10 million in a year to build it. And it's just sort of always that way with Elon. There's also some of my favorite stories are an engineer will come with like a budget for $50,000 or $100,000 for an actuator, just some sort of device to make something kind of like a valve open and close. And Elon tells him, that's no more complicated than a garage door opener. I want you to build it for $5,000. And 6 months later, the guy does it. I mean, it's kind of weird. I guess if you just set these like insane goals, sometimes people get at least like halfway there, and good things happen.
Well, yeah, and it seems like Elon, he also benefits a lot from having this sense of mission, and that really inspires the people who work for him. Another line that really struck me is one of the people who works for him at SpaceX says to some new employees, I think, if you hate people and think human extinction is okay, then fuck it, don't go to space.
Yeah.
That's how they see it, that the survival of humanity is what's at stake here when you go to work every morning.
Right. I think that's Gwynne Shotwell, right? Who's the president. Yeah, so she's the president of SpaceX, and she's this longtime aerospace industry veteran who basically quit her pretty cushy job to go work and like risk everything to go work at SpaceX, because, I mean, she joined, I think, in 2002 or 2003, so the first year, and there was like no reason to believe that SpaceX would ever accomplish what it actually set out to do. And she runs the day-to-day operations of SpaceX and is like dealing with Elon all the time, which is like no easy feat at all. I mean, he can be hard on rank and file employees, and so you can imagine, being the president of SpaceX, sort of the intensity of how much you're dealing with him and on the topics that you're dealing with him. And, she sticks through it all because she believes this is like as big of a dream and quest for her as it is for Elon. And that's how, I think that's how he gets so much out of the employees. I mean, the people at SpaceX are super bright, but they're also just incredibly driven by this mission in the same way Elon is. And it's like one of my favorite things about them. I mean, the amount of passion that you can just sort of feel going to these companies is very different than your average company.
Right. And I mean, another thing that struck me is just that before I read this book is that I might have thought to myself, oh, if I had $200 million, I could do this. I could hire a bunch of smart people and give them an idea of something I think would be good for humanity, and they would do it. And reading this book, I'm like, oh man, there's no way I could do what this guy has done. Just the amount of risk, the amount of stress, the amount of just like being mean to people. I mean, it's
crazy hard. I mean, there's kind of a litany of rich guys who tried to do stuff in space and who failed for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the other thing I found was just, it's sort of obvious that the incumbents in the government are going to be kind of a pain in the ass to deal with, but like, to do that for 10 years and you're like working so hard and you're kind of doing it on behalf of the country and just people generally, and there's always these like assholes trying to get in your way, and to just be a pain. I mean, I feel like that would wear me down so quickly. But like all those things seem to turn Elon into angry Elon, which is not the one you want to deal with at all. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of where I give him serious points, is that like his resolve is crazy, and he's kind of, and he's fighting like bureaucrats in space, and then he's fighting dealerships and Tesla and the energy companies at Solar City. It's like any one of those bags of people would be enough, I think, to drive anyone demented. To do all three at the same time is just ridiculous.
Well, and it was crazy stuff too that competitors were doing. Like they were making up stories that he had a secret family back in South Africa.
Right. Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
And I don't remember who it was, but somebody said that she got sent fake anthrax because she was trying to do private space stuff. I mean, it was just crazy things.
It was Lori Garver. She used to be the number 2 at NASA, and I put that in a footnote, which I feel really bad about now. I'm impressed. You read the book.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like this huge revelation. I sort of got it late in the reporting process and wasn't sure how to put it in. But yeah, I mean, she never named which competitor it is, but the list is like pretty small of companies that it could be. And they're telling her that Elon has a second family in South Africa and that he's got these like huge tax problems. And I mean, if that's happening, I'm the worst reporter in the world. Never like even caught a whiff of that. And Elon, I'm like 99.9% sure has like never been back to South Africa since he left when he was 17. And then she was talking about anthrax in the mail, and obviously there was all this pressure back in the day not to like let any of these private companies bid on the NASA contracts. And then since then, even since I started reporting the book in 2012, SpaceX was doing successful flights back then, but it was still sort of like a joke or it just wasn't taken. It was sort of like, this is just not going to work over the long term, and they're going to have problems. And they've just gotten, especially this last year, so consistent at doing their launches. And then, the guys who used to battle Elon in Congress have been fired from United Launch Alliance and replaced, and everyone else has had to start like a reusable rocket research program of some sort, even though SpaceX now has like this enormous lead over them. And then guys like Lockheed have had to turn to Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos to get like American-made engines. So it's like Elon's unbelievably won on every front.
But I mean, you mentioned earlier that he's not the easiest person to work with all the time, and you do go to trouble in the book to talk to critics of him to get more of a balanced picture. Do you want to just talk about what are some of you think the more telling criticisms that people had for him?
Well, I mean, because it starts on a basic level, it's a different work environment than you would find at a normal company. I mean, 6 days a week is kind of the bare minimum at Tesla and SpaceX, and Elon's pretty unapologetic about that. It's one of those things where you can be a hero and come up with like a really big idea that serves the company well, but that doesn't really buy you months or years of cover. I mean, it's kind of like, what have you done for me lately type culture. Especially at SpaceX, I mean, the early employees, they worked 100-hour weeks for years, and a lot of people get sort of burnt out by the demands and the pace. And then Elon, he's kind of got better about this over time, but he's one of those guys at a meeting. He's going to call you out in front of your peers, and sometimes with like really harsh language. And in the earlier days, like Zip2 and PayPal, I mean, he would just straight up call someone like an idiot who was like twice his age and kind of embarrass them in front of everyone. I think now he's a little better about that, although he will still go at you and sort of make you defend your argument, which is fine. He just does it in a really heated fashion. And so I just think for some people it's too much, and for other people they hang around and take it.
Right. And for this book, you also interviewed his first wife, Justine Musk. And
right.
Two quotes of hers that struck me is that Elon said to her is, one is, "I am the alpha in this relationship." And then also, "If you were my employee, I would fire you."
Everyone remembers that one. I mean, she wrote about her relationship with Elon on a blog. It was quite detailed. And then she's a writer by trade. She writes like young adult fiction, and she's quite a good writer. And
fantasy novels, I understand.
Fantasy, yeah, like sort of vampire fantasy novels. And she'd written for Marie Claire and other magazines. I mean, she's like a beautiful writer. And then, so yeah, I mean, the stuff, she's got a real turn of phrase. And I think that is sort of the thing. I think she felt like she had become an employee, and that he was kind of talking to her like he might to some other people. And then in the book, there's this woman named Mary Beth Brown who was, as far as like the whole Tony Stark Iron Man thing goes, I mean, she was his Pepper Potts. She was like the most loyal assistant you could ever imagine. She, Elon lives between Los Angeles and Silicon Valley and splits his time every week between the two cities. So you're sort of like this vagabond kind of lifestyle. And she did the same thing. She had, like, as far as I could tell, no real social life because she was working 6 or 7 days a week. And then she would do like Elon's personal, like, assistant kind of stuff, but also business things and media and marketing and she did everything. She's kind of this incredible character. And she was there for like 13 years. And then one day, to like the horror of everyone, like, he didn't fire her in as many words, but he dismissed her, and she chose from her job, and she chose not to come back. And, it was like the fact that he would do this to Mary Beth Brown was like this huge shock to everyone at all his companies. Right.
Well, and you mentioned that the media sort of christened him the real life Iron Man. What do you make of that?
I mean, it's kind of, this is caricature kind of thing, obviously, but I feel like he's kind of growing into it more and more over time. We had this funny thing one time. We were outside. He had produced a documentary, and we were standing outside, and I'm like, yeah, this Iron Man thing is all just BS. I thought he would sort of like totally downplay it, but he didn't at all. He because I'm like, you're not like Tony Stark. You're not drinking scotch in the back of a Humvee in Afghanistan. You like sort of this real like playboy kind of charismatic dude, and he's definitely not that. But he's like, well, I drank this drink called the Zombie in Haiti once when I was canoeing through the jungle and everything. So he didn't sort of downplay it. And then, I mean, one thing I kind of like is that he's different than the other tech CEOs who are mostly Silicon Valley based and who are kind of stereotypically in nerdland and happy there, which is like Elon likes Hollywood. I mean, he's different. He likes hanging out with movie stars, and he's always at the Super Bowl or the Kentucky Derby or the Mayweather fight and kind of where the action is. And that's, I think he likes being like the LA sort of physicist dude. I mean, he likes playing that role. So, it's sort of a silly caricature and everything. But then there's also like a part in the book where, I mean, I interview Robert Downey Jr. and he actually went to the SpaceX factory and got a tour of it with Elon before the first Iron Man came out, and then he made sure that there was a Tesla Roadster like right by Tony Stark's workbench, and in Robert Downey Jr.'s mind, he felt like Elon and Tony Stark were friends, and so he did sort of like inject some of this into the character.
And apparently they have a life-size Iron Man standing in somewhere in the...
They do. It's in the SpaceX building. It's not quite in the factory. It's sort of more in the... It's like it sort of moves. The last time I saw it, it was like it's kind of been put into this see-through part of an elevator, if I remember right. And it's like it's just this giant Iron Man, like in the suit and everything. And and it's sort of like just like a big prop in the SpaceX building.
Right. Well, and you quote Elon in the book. He says, maybe I read too many comics as a kid. In the comics, it always seems like they are trying to save the world. And it seems like he's trying to save the world. It's interesting. I mean, you also talk about how he open sourced all these patents for Tesla, even though it was presumably bad for business just because he thought it was good for humanity.
I haven't made up my mind on that one yet. It's weird. I mean, I feel like it was part publicity stunt and part genuine. Obviously, he did open source the patents, and yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, it's sort of like we talked about a little bit before. I mean, I think he does. I don't think he has like a god complex, but I think he definitely wants to save humanity and feels like he's one of the few people who's actually trying to do it. So I guess you have to have at least a healthy ego to sort of wake up in the morning and do that. I mean, on the patent thing, I think he genuinely, he wants like other people to make electric cars, and he feels like their technology is sort of crappy, or at least that he can give them like a head start. I think that is all sort of genuine. I also feel like he knows on some level, it's this whole like not invented here syndrome combined with like they're just not going to take Tesla's IP. So maybe it's their fault, but I feel like he knows it's not like an empty gesture, but that they're not actually probably going to do it.
Uh-huh. Well, it's interesting because I mean, in this book you have the epilogue where you sort of give your kind of like your understanding of Musk's character. I guess how long did it take you to form that idea, and do you feel like you got to the core of who he is?
I feel like I did. I mean, even before the epilogue in the last chapter, there's this. So, I mean, I want to do this delicately because I mean, I think about it seriously, and I'm not trying to be flip or anything, but, a lot of his employees think that he's like somewhere on the spectrum, and I heard that a lot over and over and over again. But I don't think, to me, I don't know enough about it, but I don't think that's the case. And I did go to like lots of psychologists and experts in this field and had really detailed, long conversations with them about Elon. And I sort of feel like there's a clinical term for a group of kids who they're called profoundly gifted. And this isn't just like some random label. I mean, it is a clinical term, and it's for kids who have extraordinarily high IQs, but they also have sort of a different perspective on life. They, from a very early age, sort of have an empathy for humanity. They see like flaws in the way people do things, and from a very early age have like identified the one or two flaws that they kind of want to fix, and it's like hard for them to let go of that. And to me, this is Elon. I think he's like forever been consumed by this idea that he can fix like some of the mistakes that people have made, and that he feels kind of like a deep empathy for humanity. He doesn't really feel like, or he doesn't let himself feel this interpersonal empathy that the rest of us do about like, how was your day or your family or anything like that. It's more about our prospects as a species. And the reason I sort of feel this way is that, he does feel emotions. I mean, he would tear up. He would be like crying about things we would talk about, whether it was his childhood or, things like the survival of man and things like that. And then at the same time, in all the interviews we did, he like never asked once about do I even have kids? He never asked me a question about myself, like, ever, I don't think. And so, he's just wired a little differently.
So what sort of responses have you gotten on the book, and have you heard from Elon about it?
Well, I mean, things like the book reviews and all that stuff have generally been really, really strong. It just reached number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, so that was good. And like people on Amazon and Audible seem to like it, so it's been really nice. I mean, I put in a ton of work, and so I wanted it to read more than just like some. Well, I definitely didn't want it to read like a dull biography, but I wanted it to read like a story, like a narrative about this guy's life. And so it feels like some people see it that way. And then Elon, well, I let him see the book when it was finished before it came out, just so he didn't have to like buy it on Amazon. He'd read it and like be hit over the head. And he kind of freaked out for a couple of days, and then a day passed, and then he came back and he said, on the whole, it's well done and it's accurate. And so, I mean, on something like as tricky as this, I felt like that was like a pretty good spot to end on. And we were never like friends or had any kind of like intimations that we were. I mean, it was like sort of like a business relationship, I guess, on some level. But and so I wanted to be objective and to tell the truth, but I certainly didn't want to like demoralize the guy or anything like that at the end.
Right. Well, I agree with you about it being an exciting book. I mean, I definitely found it thrilling to read, and it made me wish I were younger. I was like, oh, maybe I could, do more than podcasting if I had this.
I hear this like over and over again. Everyone's like, oh, it made me feel like I hadn't done anything with my life. I mean, I guess you could I could definitely see where that comes from. On the other hand, kind of while I was writing it, and then I was kind of hoping on the other side people would be like, well, maybe now I'm going to like push myself, from where I'm going. And because like while I was writing it, and Elon would give me a tough time sometimes, I'd just be like, what would Elon do? He would like just not back down, and he would not give up. And I feel like once you hear some of the stories about what he did, you can like apply a little bit of. I don't think anyone can like be like Elon totally, but you can apply some of it in your life.
Right. Well, I think this is sort of the dream for science fiction writers. At least one of them is that some kid might read your book or listen to your podcast and grow up to be Elon Musk and transform the world. So I don't know if there are any kids out there listening to this. Do you have any advice for how they could become the next Elon Musk?
Well, I mean, I think his life sort of proves that it's possible, because they didn't have a podcast, but I mean, essentially did the same thing. I think it was getting the right message at the right time, for sure. I think people ask me, like, can you be like Elon? I mean, because of the reasons I talked about with the profoundly gifted thing, and then there's some parts you would never want. Like, he had a horrendous childhood, both from like his family and other kids at school and things like that. It's kind of like, well, do you want to be tortured as kind of a recipe for success? I mean, I guess you have to ask yourself that question. But I think the thing that I take away is that pretty much sort of where we started with the Hitchhiker's Guide is like, find what really matters to you, and when you do, don't half-ass it.
All right, then one last thing I wanted to ask you about. Right at the beginning of the book, there's this line about Elon, what Elon worries about. And you say, he opened up about the major fear keeping him up at night, namely that Google's co-founder and CEO Larry Page might well have been building a fleet of artificial intelligence-enhanced robots capable of destroying mankind. Which is totally what happened. We sort of sat down where you would be like, hey, how's it going? But that's what I said. Hey, how's it going? he said, I'm afraid that Larry Page is going to kill us all. So, like, not in like a funny way, in a really sort of depressed way. I mean, they have the craziest relationship of like anyone in Silicon Valley, I think, because they're friends, and Elon stays at Larry's house when he's in Silicon Valley. Then he obviously thinks Larry's like a well-meaning, good person, but he totally also thinks he's like possibly building the end of mankind. And Elon, he invests in all these artificial intelligence companies. He says to like keep an eye on how they're going, and like one that he was invested in was DeepMind, which has some very powerful AI that Google acquired. And so I think it's just starting to like freak Elon out. I mean, he would come back, it sort of like worsened
that was essentially like one of our first interviews, and then over the course of time, it just got worse and worse and worse. And Tallulah Riley, his most recent wife, would tell me that she and Elon talk about this like late into the night and freak out about it together. And so this was like his very real fear.
Wow. All right. So unfortunately, Ashlee, we're pretty much out of time. Do you just have anything else you want to mention in terms of other projects you're working on or other books or anything like that?
That's sort of the big thing. I'm kind of trying to regroup myself a little bit after doing this. And I'm like sort of thinking maybe of doing like a young adult version of this with like full of really cool science fiction illustrations and everything. I think just because there was so much interest from like young people while I was writing. But that's it for right now.
Well, that sounds great. No, I hope you're able to do that. And so, we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Ashlee Vance, and this new book, it's called Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. So Ashlee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Ashlee Vance for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Massively Max, who writes, I have a job that lets me listen to podcasts all day on headphones, and I just finished mainlining the entirety of Geek's Guide. I'll add my voice to the chorus that rightfully says this is one of the best nerd topic podcasts running. I was looking for interviews with writers, and David and John do an excellent job of interviewing. The panels are great as well. It has made me interested in doing some writing of my own. Here's to many more episodes from these highly intelligent, well-read guys. So big thanks again to Massively Max for that great review. And of course, a special thank you to Greg Harris and Benjamin Keel, who both signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.